Princess Kyrales Vorshan stood before her father's throne, with her hands clasped behind her back, and her face showing nothing of the storm inside her heart. The Emperor of the Volanthi spoke in his deep and ancient voice, and every word felt like a chain wrapping around her future. "You will marry the human," he said, and the court fell silent around them. Kyrales had known this day would come, for she was the third daughter, and third daughters were always given away for politics and trade agreements. Her older sisters had married powerful Volanthi lords, but she would be sent to share her life with a creature from a young and unremarkable world called Earth. The Volanthi were an elegant species who had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years. They stood tall and graceful, with silver skin that shimmered like starlight, and eyes that could see into the ultraviolet spectrum. They lived for centuries and possessed natural telepathic abilities that let them sense emotions and intentions. They were refined and cultured and proud. Humans were none of these things. Kyrales had studied the reports about humanity, and she had found nothing impressive. They were soft creatures with fragile bodies and short lifespans. They had no natural weapons, no telepathy, no special abilities of any kind. They came from a small blue world on the edge of explored space, and they had only achieved interstellar travel a mere 200 years ago. By galactic standards, humans were practically children. "The Terran Confederation has requested this union to seal our trade agreement," her father continued, his golden eyes fixed upon her. "They want access to the mining operations in the outer reach, and we want their unusual manufacturing techniques. This marriage will bind our peoples together." "Yes, father," Kyrales said, because there was nothing else to say. The court whispered behind elegant fans and long sleeves, and she could feel their pity and their amusement washing over her in telepathic waves. Poor Kyrales, they thought. The princess who would be given to a pet. 1 week later, the human arrived. His shuttle landed in the palace courtyard, a boxy and practical vessel that looked ugly next to the flowing curves of Volanthi architecture. Kyrales stood with her attendants and watched as the door opened and her future husband stepped out into the golden sunlight. Captain Elias Vance was not what she had expected. He was shorter than a Volanthi male, standing only 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a compact build. His skin was a warm brown color, and his hair was black and cut short against his skull. He had dark eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And he smiled the moment he saw her. "Princess Kyrales," he said, and his voice was warm and genuine. "I have heard so much about you, and I am honored to meet you at last." He bowed in the Volanthi fashion, though his form was slightly wrong, and Kyrales felt a flicker of something that might have been surprise. He had studied their customs. He had tried to learn. "Captain Vance," she replied with a formal nod, "welcome to the Volanthi Empire." He carried very little with him, just a single bag over his shoulder, and a long object wrapped in old cloth that he held with obvious care. One of the palace guards stepped forward and gestured at the wrapped item. "What is that?" the guard demanded. Elias smiled that easy smile again, and pulled back the cloth to reveal a curved blade in a decorated sheath. The metal was old and dark, and strange symbols were carved into the handle. "A family heirloom," he explained. "My great-great-grandmother carried this sword, and her grandmother before her. It has been in my family for over 400 years, and I could not leave it behind." The guard examined the weapon with obvious disdain. It was primitive and ancient, a relic from a time before energy weapons and plasma rifles. What possible threat could such a thing pose? "You may keep your antique," the guard said with a dismissive wave. Kyrales watched her future husband tuck the sword under his arm like a precious child, and she wondered what kind of man carried such an old and useless thing across the stars. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later, in the Grand Temple of Stars. Kirilleth wore the traditional silver gown of a Volanthi bride, and Elias wore a formal black suit that he said was the custom of his people. They spoke the ancient vows, while 1,000 nobles watched and whispered. The princess married a pet, they said. How sad. How amusing. Kirilleth heard every whisper through her telepathic senses, and she kept her face smooth and calm. Elias could not hear them, of course, for humans had no telepathic abilities. He simply stood beside her, with that warm smile on his face, speaking his vows with what seemed like genuine feeling. I promise to protect you, he said, and his dark eyes met hers. I promise to stand beside you in times of peace and times of trouble. I promise to honor you and cherish you for all the days of my life. Strange words, Kirilleth thought. Volanthi wedding vows spoke of duty and alliance and political benefit. They did not speak of protection or cherishing. What did this human think he could protect her from? He was the weakest creature in the entire palace. After the ceremony, they retired to the chambers that would be their shared home. Elias walked around the beautiful rooms with obvious wonder in his eyes, touching the silk curtains and examining the artwork on the walls. This is incredible, he said. The craftsmanship is unlike anything I have ever seen. Volanthi artisans have perfected their skills over thousands of years, Kirilleth replied. And I have so much to learn, Elias said, turning to face her. I know this marriage was not your choice, princess. I know you must be disappointed to be bound to someone like me. But I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to be a good husband to you. Kirilleth studied him for a long moment, reaching out with her telepathic senses to read his emotions. She expected to find arrogance, or hidden ambition, or perhaps resentment at being sent so far from his home. Instead, she found only warmth and sincerity, and a genuine desire to make her happy. How strange, she thought. How unexpected. We shall see, Captain Vance, she said. Please, he replied with another smile. Call me Elias. In the days that followed, Kirilleth watched her new husband with careful attention. He woke early each morning and disappeared for several hours before returning to join her for breakfast. He spent his afternoons in the palace gardens, learning the names of every flower and plant. He visited the imperial archives and read everything he could find about Volanthi history and culture. He asked questions constantly about their art and music and philosophy. He listened with genuine interest when she explained the complexities of court politics. He laughed at his own jokes and seemed unbothered when the nobles mocked him behind their fans. Her cousin Lord Malthius was the worst of them all. He was a tall and arrogant Volanthi male who had once hoped to marry Kirilleth himself and claim her position in the imperial family. Now he took every opportunity to humiliate her human husband. Perhaps you would like to spar with me, Malthius suggested one evening in the great hall, his voice dripping with false friendliness. A friendly match to help you understand Volanthi combat traditions. Elias shook his head with an apologetic smile. I am afraid I must decline, my lord. Humans are not built for combat the way your people are. I would only embarrass myself. The court laughed, and Malthius smiled with cruel satisfaction. But Kirilleth noticed something odd. For just a moment, when Malthius had issued his challenge, something had flickered in her husband's dark eyes. Something cold and calculating, that vanished so quickly she almost thought she had imagined it. She reached out with her telepathic senses to read his emotions, but all she found was that same warmth and good humor. How very strange, she thought. How very strange indeed. 6 months passed in the Volanthi palace, and Kirilleth found herself growing accustomed to her human husband in ways she had never expected. Elias had become a familiar presence in her life, a quiet and gentle companion who seemed to anticipate her needs before she even knew them herself. When she was tired, he would appear with a cup of her favorite tea. When she was frustrated with court politics, he would make her laugh with some ridiculous human story. When she needed silence, he would sit beside her without speaking and simply let her be. He was not at all what the galaxy said humans were supposed to be. The nobles of the court still whispered and mocked, calling him the princess's pet and the Volante's trained animal. They made jokes about his short lifespan and his lack of telepathy and his soft human body. But Elias never seemed to notice or care, and his endless good humor made Kyrilleth feel something warm growing in her chest. Was this what humans called affection? She was not entirely sure. Every morning, Elias woke before the twin suns rose above the palace walls. Kyrilleth would stir in their shared bed and feel the warmth of his body leave as he slipped away into the darkness. She asked him once where he went during those early hours. "I like to walk in the gardens before anyone else is awake," he said with his easy smile. "The flowers look different in the pre-dawn light, and the quiet helps me think." It seemed like a reasonable answer, but Kyrilleth noticed that when he returned from these walks, there was always a faint sheen of sweat on his skin. His breathing was slightly elevated, and his muscles seemed warm and loose. These were not the signs of a peaceful morning stroll. She decided not to press him, but she stored the observation away in her mind. There were other oddities as well. Elias's hands were gentle when he touched her, soft and careful, like he was handling something precious. But those same hands were covered in thick calluses that did not come from gardening or reading books. They were the calluses of someone who gripped something hard and swung it through the air for hours at a time. The wrapped sword still sat in the corner of their chambers, untouched and ignored. Elias never spoke of it, and never unwrapped it. But sometimes Kyrilleth saw him glance at it with an expression she could not read. One night, Kyrilleth woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside their chambers. It was late, long past midnight, and no servants should have been moving through this part of the palace. She reached out with her telepathic senses, and felt unfamiliar minds, cold and focused and filled with deadly intent. Assassins. She opened her mouth to scream for the guards, but before she could make a sound, she realized that Elias was already awake. He was standing between the bed and the door, his body tense and ready, his eyes fixed on the entrance with an intensity she had never seen before. He had heard them before she did. He had positioned himself to protect her before she even knew there was danger. The assassins never made it past the outer corridor. The palace guards intercepted them and cut them down in a brief and violent battle. When the captain of the guard came to report the incident, he found Elias sitting calmly in a chair by the window, apparently reading a book by lamplight. "We heard some noise," Elias said with an apologetic shrug. "I hope everything is all right." The guard captain looked at the human with barely concealed contempt. "Assassins tried to reach your chambers, but we dealt with them. You were never in any danger." "How fortunate," Elias replied. "We are grateful for your protection." After the guard left, Kyrilleth sat up in bed and stared at her husband. "You were standing by the door," she said. "Before the guards arrived, you were standing between me and the door." Elias turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Then he smiled that warm smile she knew so well. "I heard a noise and went to investigate. It was probably nothing." It was not nothing, and they both knew it. But Kyrilleth did not push, and Elias did not explain. The weeks continued to pass, and Kyrilleth began to notice more and more details about her husband that did not fit the picture of a harmless human. He memorized the patrol routes of every guard in the palace. He knew which doors could be locked from inside, and which had weak hinges. He had mapped every corridor and every secret passage, though he claimed he was simply interested in Volanthe architecture. When they attended court functions, Elias seemed to notice everything. His eyes would track across the room, noting who spoke to whom and who avoided each other. He remembered every name and every relationship and every hint of political tension. "You are very observant," Kyrillef said to him one evening after a particularly dull diplomatic reception. "I find people fascinating," Elias replied. "Everyone has a story, if you know how to look." Lord Malthius continued his campaign of humiliation throughout these months. He challenged Elias to duels that the human politely declined. He made cruel jokes at banquets that Elias laughed off with good humor. He even suggested once that Kyrillef should take a Volanthi lover, since her human husband was surely inadequate. Elias had simply smiled at that comment, but Kyrillef felt something change in the air around him. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, and for just a moment she felt a wave of emotion from her husband that her telepathy could barely process. It was cold and dark and ancient, like looking into a deep well that had no bottom. It lasted only a heartbeat, and then it was gone, replaced by the familiar warmth she knew. "My wife is free to make her own choices," Elias said calmly, "but I appreciate your concern, my lord." Malthius had frowned at that response, sensing somehow that his barb had not landed the way he intended. He walked away, muttering under his breath. That night, as they prepared for bed, Kyrillef found herself staring at the wrapped sword in the corner. "Will you tell me about your family heirloom?" she asked. Elias paused in the middle of removing his jacket. He looked at the sword for a long moment, and his face became very still. "It was forged over 400 years ago," he said quietly, "on Earth during a time of great warfare and bloodshed. A master swordsmith named Muramasa created it, and he folded the steel over 15,000 times to make the blade strong and sharp. My ancestors carried it through many battles and many generations." "But humans do not fight with swords anymore," Kyrillef said. "You have energy weapons and plasma rifles." "We do," Elias agreed. "But some of us still remember the old ways. Some of us keep the skills alive, even when they seem to have no purpose." "Why?" Kyrillef asked. Elias turned to look at her, and his dark eyes were unreadable. "Because humans have learned that peace is not guaranteed. We have learned that the soft times do not last forever, and that the darkness always returns eventually. We keep the old skills sharp, because we know that someday we might need them again." He smiled then, and the warmth returned to his face. "But that is just an old tradition. Nothing to worry about." Kyrillef nodded and said nothing more. But as she lay in bed that night, she could not stop thinking about her husband's words. The darkness always returns eventually. What kind of species thought that way? What kind of people prepared for violence even in times of peace? What kind of man carried an ancient sword across the stars, just in case? She looked at Elias sleeping peacefully beside her, his face soft and relaxed in the moonlight. He looked so gentle. He looked so harmless. But somewhere deep inside her, Kyrillef was beginning to wonder if she had misjudged her human husband. Somewhere deep inside her, she was beginning to feel afraid, and she was not entirely sure if she was afraid of him or afraid for whoever might threaten him. The Night of Ascension was the most sacred festival in the Volanthi Empire, a celebration of the ancient heroes who had first united the warring tribes under a single banner. Every noble family gathered in the imperial palace to feast and dance and honor the traditions of their people. Kyrillef wore a gown of shimmering blue that matched the color of the twin moons, and Elias wore his formal black suit with a silver pin shaped like an earth bird called an eagle. They stood together in the grand ballroom as thousands of guests swirled around them in elegant patterns. "You look beautiful tonight," Elias said, and Kyrillef felt the warmth in his words through her telepathic senses. "You are being charming again," she replied, but she could not help the small smile that touched her lips. 8 months of marriage had changed something between them. Kyrilleth no longer saw Elias as a burden or a political inconvenience. She looked forward to their conversations and their quiet evenings together. She missed him when he was away, even if only for a few hours. Was this what humans called love? She was beginning to think it might be. Lord Malthius appeared at the edge of the crowd, watching them with cold eyes. He had been strange lately, absent from court functions, and secretive about his activities. Kyrilleth had assumed he was sulking about her marriage, but tonight he seemed different. There was an excitement in his expression, a barely contained anticipation that made her uneasy. "Something is wrong," she murmured to Elias. "I know," he replied, and his voice was very calm. "I have known for 3 weeks." Before Kyrilleth could ask what he meant, the lights in the ballroom went dark. Screams erupted from the crowd as the emergency systems failed, one by one. Then came a sound that Kyrilleth would remember for the rest of her life. The crack of teleportation gates opening inside the palace walls. Soldiers poured through the shimmering portals, tall and armored and carrying plasma rifles. They wore the black and red colors of the Kethvari hegemony, a militaristic empire that had long been enemies of the Volanthi. They moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the panicked nobles and cutting off every exit. "Nobody move," a harsh voice commanded. "By order of the new emperor, you are all under arrest." The new emperor? Kyrilleth's blood ran cold as she saw Lord Malthius step forward, his face split in a triumphant grin. He had done this. He had betrayed the empire to their enemies. "The age of the old dynasty is over," Malthius announced. "The emperor has been captured, and his daughters will serve as hostages to ensure cooperation. The Volanthi Empire now belongs to the Kethvari hegemony, with me as their appointed governor." Kyrilleth felt terror grip her heart. Her father captured, her sisters in chains, everything she had ever known collapsing around her in a single night. She felt Elias's hand on her arm, guiding her backward through the chaos. "We need to move," he said quietly, "now." They slipped through the crowd while the Kethvari soldiers were busy rounding up the most important nobles. Elias seemed to know exactly where to go, leading her through servant corridors and hidden passages that she had not even known existed. His hand was steady on hers, his movements sure and confident. "How do you know this path?" she gasped as they ran. "I have been preparing," he said, "just in case." They emerged in the western gallery, a long corridor lined with ancient paintings and sculptures. For a moment, Kyrilleth thought they might escape. But then, the doors at both ends burst open, and Kethvari soldiers flooded in from every direction. 20 of them, maybe more. Each one stood 8 feet tall, covered in phase plate armor that could stop plasma bolts and edged weapons alike. They were the elite warriors of the hegemony, trained from birth to fight and kill. And there, standing among them with that cruel smile, was Lord Malthius. "Did you really think you could escape, cousin?" he sneered. "The palace is completely surrounded. There is nowhere to run." The soldiers raised their weapons, and Kyrilleth felt despair wash over her. This was the end. They would be captured and used as bargaining chips, or perhaps simply killed, to send a message. She reached for Elias's hand, wanting to hold him one last time before the darkness took them. But Elias was no longer beside her. He had stepped forward, placing himself between Kyrilleth and the soldiers. His posture had changed completely. No longer the relaxed and gentle man she knew. His shoulders were squared, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his eyes scanning the room with cold precision. "Elias," she whispered. "What are you doing? There are too many of them." "Stay behind me," he said, and his voice was different now. There was no warmth in it, no humor, no softness. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision and would not be moved. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. The sword. He had been carrying it all along, hidden beneath his formal suit. How had she not noticed? How had anyone not noticed? Malthus laughed. What is that supposed to be? An antique? Do you think a piece of primitive metal will protect you from phase plate armor? Elias did not answer. Instead, he unwrapped the cloth with careful, practiced movements, and drew the blade from its sheath. The sword sang as it cleared the scabbard, a high and pure note that seemed to hang in the air. The blade was beautiful and terrible, dark steel that caught the emergency lights and gleamed with deadly promise. 400 years old, and still sharp enough to split a hair. Kirilleth saw her husband's face in the reflection of that ancient blade, and she did not recognize him. The kind eyes had become cold and hard. The easy smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute focus. This was not Elias the gentle gardener, or Elias the curious scholar. This was something else entirely. I gave you a chance, Elias said to the soldiers. I smiled and bowed, and let you think I was harmless. I did everything I could to avoid this moment. He raised the sword in a two-handed grip, his body settling into a stance that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. But you threatened my wife, he continued, and now you are going to learn why humans smile so much. Why is that? Malthus demanded, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. Elias looked at him with those cold, dark eyes. Because we learned a long time ago that it is easier to kill someone who does not see you coming. Kirilleth felt something pulse from her husband in that moment, something her telepathy could barely comprehend. It was not an emotion she had ever sensed before, not anger, or fear, or hatred. It was something older and darker, something that had been bred into human bones over millions of years of evolution. It was the instinct of a predator that had clawed its way to the top of its food chain, not through strength or speed, but through sheer, relentless persistence. The first Kethvari soldier raised his rifle to fire. Elias moved, and Kirilleth finally understood what her husband really was. The first soldier died before he could pull the trigger. Elias crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion, his sword cutting upward in a perfect arc that found the gap between helmet and chestplate. The blade sliced through flesh and bone like they were nothing, and the massive Kethvari warrior collapsed without making a sound. The other soldiers froze for half a heartbeat, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. A human? Moving that fast? Killing one of their elite warriors with a single strike? That half-heartbeat was all Elias needed. He was among them now, flowing like water between their armored bodies. He did not fight the way Valanthi warriors fought, with honor and formal exchanges of blows. He did not fight the way Kethvari soldiers fought, with overwhelming force and brutal efficiency. He fought like something wild and ancient, something that had learned to kill in a world with no rules and no mercy. The second soldier swung his rifle like a club, trying to crush the small human beneath its weight. Elias ducked under the blow, pivoted on his heel, and drove his blade into the joint behind the warrior's knee. The soldier screamed and fell, and Elias was already moving past him toward the third. Kirilleth pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been awe. She had seen Valanthi duels and Kethvari battle footage, but she had never seen anything like this. Her husband was not just fighting, he was dancing. Every movement flowed into the next, precise and economical and devastatingly effective. The third soldier managed to fire his plasma rifle, but Elias was no longer where he had been standing. The bolt scorched the wall behind him as he rolled under the shot and came up inside the warrior's guard. The sword flashed twice, and the soldier's weapon arm fell to the ground, followed by his head. "Kill him!" Malthus screamed. "He is just one human. Kill him!" The remaining soldiers finally coordinated their attack, forming a firing line to bring the human down with massed plasma fire. It was a sound tactical decision against most enemies. But humans were not most enemies. Elias had already read their intentions. He grabbed the falling body of the third soldier and used it as a shield, charging directly into the firing line while plasma bolts slammed into the armored corpse. The soldiers tried to adjust their aim, but Elias was too close now, too fast, too relentless. He burst through their line like a predator through a herd of prey, and the sword began its terrible work. 6 soldiers fell in rapid succession, each one killed with a single precise strike. Elias targeted the weak points in their armor, the joints and gaps that no warrior could fully protect. He moved constantly, never staying still long enough to be targeted, using the soldiers themselves as obstacles to block their companions' shots. Kyrilleth watched her husband fight, and she finally understood what humans were. They were not the soft and harmless creatures the galaxy believed them to be. They were predators who had evolved on a death world, a planet so hostile that every other species had to fight constantly just to survive. They had no claws or fangs or armor, so they had developed something far more dangerous, a mind that never stopped adapting, never stopped learning, never stopped finding new ways to kill. And they had spent their entire history fighting each other, the most dangerous prey of all. Elias was breathing hard now, sweat dripping down his face, but he showed no signs of slowing. The Kethvari were faster than him and stronger than him, but he simply would not stop. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he found a way out. Every time they tried to overwhelm him with numbers, he turned their formation against them. This was what humans called persistence hunting, Kyrilleth realized. They did not need to be the fastest or the strongest. They just needed to keep going until their prey could not continue anymore. 10 soldiers down, 12, 15. The remaining warriors began to back away, fear finally overtaking their training. They had never faced anything like this. They had conquered dozens of species, and none of them had ever fought with such savage determination. Malthius was screaming now, his face twisted with rage and terror. "Stand your ground, you cowards. It is just one human." "Just one human," Elias repeated, and his voice was cold enough to freeze the air. "You keep saying that like it means something." He pointed his blood-soaked blade at the cowering traitor. "Let me tell you something about humans, Malthius. We have a history, a long and bloody history, filled with wars and monsters and darkness. We have faced extinction a dozen times, and every single time, we survived. We survived ice ages and plagues and predators. We survived each other, which was the hardest challenge of all." He took a step forward, and the remaining soldiers scrambled backward. "Do you know what we learned from all that suffering? We learned that nothing is more dangerous than a human who has something to protect." He looked back at Kyrilleth, and for just a moment, the warmth returned to his eyes. "And I have something very precious to protect." The last 5 soldiers broke and ran, abandoning their lord in their desperation to escape. Malthius tried to flee with them, but Elias was faster. The human caught the traitor by the collar and threw him to the ground. "Please," Malthius begged, all his arrogance gone. "Please, I surrender. I will give you anything you want." "I want you to answer a question," Elias said, pressing the tip of his sword against the Valanthi's throat. "Where is the Emperor? Where are the other princesses?" "The throne room," Malthius gasped. "They are all in the throne room, guarded by the hegemony's commander. Please, do not kill me." Elias stared down at the pathetic creature for a long moment. Then he pulled back his sword and turned to Kyrilleth. "Can you fight?" he asked. Kyrilleth straightened her spine and met his eyes. "I am a princess of the Valanthi Empire. Of course I can fight." A ghost of a smile crossed her husband's blood-spattered face. "Good. We have a palace to take back." They moved through the corridors together, Elias leading the way with his blade ready. They encountered more soldiers along the way, but the word had spread. "The humans are fighting back," the whispers said. "The human is killing everyone who faces him." Some soldiers tried to stand against them and fell beneath Elias's sword. Others saw him coming and fled without firing a shot. Fear was spreading through the hegemony's forces like a disease, and Elias was the source of that infection. They reached the throne room to find it heavily guarded, with the Emperor and Kyrilet's sisters bound in chains before the enemy commander. The massive Kethvari officer looked up as Elias kicked open the doors, and his eyes widened with shock. "What is this?" the commander demanded. "You are supposed to be captured or dead." Elias walked into the throne room, leaving bloody footprints on the ancient stone floor. His sword was dripping, his clothes were torn, and his eyes were the eyes of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "I have a message for your hegemony," he said. "This system is under human protection now. Take your ships and leave, or I will personally ensure that none of you survive to regret it." The commander laughed, though the sound was nervous. "You are one man, one small, weak human. The hegemony has conquered 100 worlds." Elias smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Then let me give you a demonstration of what one small, weak human can do." He raised his sword and charged, and the Kethvari learned the true price of underestimating humanity. The battle in the throne room lasted only 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes changed the course of galactic history. The Kethvari commander died with a look of absolute disbelief on his face, unable to understand how a single human had cut through his elite guard like they were made of paper. His last words were a question that would echo through the hegemony for generations. "What are you?" Elias did not answer. He simply cleaned his blade on the commander's cloak and turned to free the emperor from his chains. The old Valanthi ruler looked at his human son-in-law with new eyes, seeing past the gentle exterior to the warrior beneath. "You saved us," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "You saved us all." "I made a promise," Elias replied. "On my wedding day I promised to protect your daughter in times of peace and times of trouble. I keep my promises." Kyrilleth rushed to embrace her sisters, tears streaming down her silver cheeks. They were alive, bruised and frightened, but alive. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. Within the hour, the full scope of the situation became clear. The Kethvari hegemony had sent an entire fleet to secure their conquest of the Valanthi system. Dozens of warships hung in orbit above the planet, ready to bombard the surface if their ground forces failed. The palace guard had rallied and driven the remaining soldiers back, but they could not fight a fleet. The Valanthi had powerful defenses, but they had been sabotaged by Malthius's traitors. Without help, the empire would fall. Help came from an unexpected direction. 3 massive ships dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the system, moving at impossible speeds toward the Kethvari fleet. They were blocky and utilitarian, nothing like the elegant Valanthi vessels or the predatory Kethvari warships. They were covered in weapons, bristling with guns and missile tubes and energy cannons. They were human. The flagship broadcast a message on all frequencies, and a gruff voice filled every speaker in the system. "This is Admiral Chen of the Terran Confederation 3rd Fleet. We are here in response to a distress signal from our citizen Captain Elias Vance. All Kethvari vessels will power down their weapons and prepare to be escorted out of this system immediately. Any ship that resists will be destroyed." The Kethvari commander, the one commanding the fleet, not the one Elias had killed, laughed at the threat. 3 human ships against his entire armada? The humans were more foolish than he had thought. "You are outnumbered 20-1, he sneered. "Your bluff will not work." "Who said anything about a bluff?" Admiral Chen replied. 2 more fleets dropped out of hyperspace, then another. Within minutes, over 200 Terran warships surrounded the Kethvari armada, their weapons locked and ready. They had been waiting just beyond sensor range, prepared for this exact moment. The humans had known. They had known about the coup before it happened, and they had positioned their forces to respond. All those months of Elias smiling and bowing and seeming harmless, and the entire time, humanity had been watching, waiting, planning. The Kethvari fleet surrendered without firing a single shot. Later, after the prisoners had been taken, and the traitors arrested and the damage assessed, Kyrilleth found Elias in the palace gardens. He was kneeling beside a bed of night-blooming flowers, his bloody clothes replaced by simple robes, his terrible sword wrapped in cloth once more. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the warmth return to his eyes. The predator was gone, replaced by the gentle man she had married. How could both exist in the same person? How could someone so kind also be so deadly? You planned this, she said. All of it. Not all of it, Elias replied. I did not know when the coup would happen, or how, but I knew it was coming. Your cousin's ambition was obvious to anyone who paid attention, and the hegemony had been looking for a way into Velanthi's space for years. So you prepared? I always prepare, he said. It is what humans do. Kyrilleth sat down beside him on the garden path. The twin moons were rising, casting silver light across the flowers. It was beautiful and peaceful, and she could almost forget the blood that had been spilled just hours before. The galaxy thinks humans are harmless, she said. They think you are a young and weak species, easy to ignore. We encourage that belief, Elias admitted. It is easier to be underestimated, easier to smile and trade and learn, while quietly positioning ourselves across 1,000 worlds. When our enemies finally realize what we are, it is usually too late. And what are you? Kyrilleth asked, echoing the dying commander's question. Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice was soft and sad. We are survivors, he said. We came from a world that tried to kill us every day, and we refused to die. We fought predators and diseases and the very planet itself, and we won. Then we fought each other because we could not stop fighting, and somehow we survived that too. He looked up at the stars, his dark eyes reflecting their light. We learned to hide our fangs behind smiles. We learned to speak softly while carrying big weapons. We spread across the galaxy, and everywhere we went, we watched and listened and remembered. We are not conquerors, Kyrilleth. We do not want to rule anyone. Then what do you want? We want to protect the people we love, Elias said, turning to face her. That is all we have ever wanted. Everything else, the fleets, the weapons, the training, all of it exists for one purpose, to keep our families safe. He reached out and took her hand, and his touch was gentle despite the calluses. You asked me once why I carry that old sword, he said. I carry it to remind myself that peace is precious and fragile. I carry it because my ancestors learned that the darkness always returns, and someone must be ready to face it. I carry it because I promised to protect you, and I will never break that promise. Kyrilleth felt tears forming in her eyes, not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of something else entirely. She had spent 8 months married to this man, thinking she knew him, and only now was she finally seeing the truth. More dangerous than any creature she had ever known. But he was also kind and gentle and loving, and he had risked everything to save her and her family. The court will want to honor you, she said. My father will offer you titles and wealth and power. I do not want those things, Elias replied. What do you want? He smiled, and it was the same warm smile she had fallen in love with. I want to go back to tending the gardens. I want to read books in the archive and learn about Valanthi history. I want to bring you tea when you are tired and make you laugh when you are sad. I want to be your husband, Kyrilleth. Not a warrior, not a hero, just your husband. Kyrilleth leaned forward and kissed him, and she felt the last of her doubts melt away. This strange and terrifying and wonderful human was hers, and she was his, and that was all that mattered. "And if the darkness returns," she whispered against his lips. Elias pulled back and looked at her with those dark eyes that had seen so much blood. "Then I will remind the galaxy why Earth's oldest stories are about monsters," he said, "and the humans who killed them." He kissed her again, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird began to sing. The princess had married what she thought was a harmless pet. She had discovered instead that she had married a wolf, patient and deadly and absolutely devoted to her.